I've spent my entire adult life studying patterns in nature, tracking migration routes, analyzing territorial behaviors, cataloging the predictable rhythms of wild things. But nothing in my years of field research prepared me for what arrived at my cabin door on a rain-soaked October morning. A package with no return address, wrapped in weathered canvas that smelled of smoke and earth. Inside, nestled among dried moss and cedar needles, I found a damaged digital recorder and a handwritten note containing only coordinates and 3 words. "They are real." My hands trembled as I connected the device to my laptop, and in those first grainy frames of footage, I watched something that should not exist move through a forest cathedral with the deliberate grace of conscious thought. The figure was massive, easily 8 feet tall, its form obscured by shadow and distance, yet unmistakably bipedal, unmistakably purposeful in its movements. What disturbed me most wasn't its size or its existence, but the way it paused mid-stride and turned, its head toward the hidden camera, as if it knew it was being observed, as if it was allowing itself to be seen. I watched that footage hundreds of times over the following weeks, frame by frame, searching for evidence of manipulation or costume work, desperate to apply my scientific training to something that defied every rational explanation. The creature moved through dense undergrowth without disturbing the canopy, navigated fallen logs with an economy of motion that suggested intimate knowledge of the terrain, and at one point reached out to touch the bark of an ancient cedar with what I can only describe as reverence. My colleagues would have dismissed it immediately as an elaborate hoax, and perhaps that's what I should have done. But something deeper than professional curiosity had awakened in me, a resonance with memories I'd buried since childhood. I remembered my grandfather in his final years, pulling me close by the fireplace and speaking in hushed tones about the old forests, about boundaries that must never be crossed, about watchers in the deep woods who remembered when the world was young. He'd called them the old ones, and his eyes held not fear but a profound respect, a sadness I was too young to understand. Now, staring at this impossible footage, his words returned to me like an inheritance I'd never wanted to claim. The rational part of my mind constructed arguments against believing what I was seeing, building walls of skepticism and demanding empirical proof. But those defenses crumbled each time I replayed the final seconds of the recording. In that last moment, before the footage degraded into static, the creature stopped at the edge of a clearing and looked directly into the camera with eyes that caught the ambient light, eyes that held something I recognized despite the grainy resolution. Not animal cunning, but awareness, intelligence, perhaps even sorrow. I tried to trace the package's origin, but the postal markings had been deliberately obscured, and the coordinates pointed to a region of the Pacific Northwest, so remote that even topographical maps showed nothing but unnamed valleys and uncharted forest. Sleep became impossible as questions consumed me. Who had sent this footage? Why had they chosen me? And what did they expect me to do with evidence that could shatter the boundaries between myth and reality? My grandfather's warnings echoed through my restless nights, but beneath the caution I heard something else. An invitation, a calling, a door opening to mysteries that had waited generations for someone willing to step through. Within 2 weeks, I'd made my decision, assembling a small team of trusted colleagues under the pretense of surveying unexplored habitat for my research. I told them we were tracking rumors of an undocumented elk migration corridor, a mundane enough premise to avoid difficult questions, but I packed equipment for documenting something far more significant. As I loaded the truck with supplies and reviewed our route into those nameless mountains, I felt the weight of crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. The footage sat encrypted on a drive in my pocket, a secret that burned against my chest like a coal, and I understood with unsettling clarity that this expedition would either validate everything my grandfather had whispered about, or reveal me as a fool chasing shadows into the wilderness. Either way, the man who would emerge from Those forests would not be the same one who entered them, and some part of me, the part that still remembered believing in mysteries before the world taught me to demand proof, welcomed that transformation with something close to relief. The journey into those mountains felt like traveling backward through time, each mile stripping away another layer of the modern world until we existed in a realm governed by older laws. We followed logging roads that had surrendered to reclamation decades ago, their cracked asphalt veins disappearing beneath moss and fern, and when even those vestiges of civilization ended, we continued on foot with packs heavy enough to anchor us to reality. My 3 colleagues: Sarah, an ecologist with 15 years tracking predator populations; Marcus, a documentary filmmaker whose camera had captured vanishing cultures across 6 continents; and Tom, a wilderness guide who knew these mountains better than anyone I could have hired, moved through the forest with professional efficiency, unaware that I was leading them towards something that would challenge everything we thought we understood about the boundaries of the natural world. I felt the weight of my deception like a stone in my chest, knowing I'd brought them here under false pretenses, but something greater than honesty compelled me forward. The coordinates from the mysterious package led us deeper into territory that appeared on no ranger maps, where the trees grew so ancient and massive that walking among them felt like trespassing in a cathedral built before human memory. The forest canopy closed above us like a living ceiling, filtering sunlight into ethereal shafts that illuminated scenes of such pristine wilderness that I understood why places like this might harbor secrets the modern world had declared impossible. On the 3rd day, we entered a valley that shouldn't have existed according to our topographical surveys, a hidden basin surrounded by granite ridges that formed a natural barrier against discovery and intrusion. The moment we descended into that isolated sanctuary, the quality of the air itself seemed to change, becoming thicker, older, charged with a presence that raised the hair on my arms and made my pulse quicken with instinctive recognition. The forest here felt fundamentally different from anything I'd experienced in 20 years of field research, not hostile, but watchful, as if the trees themselves were measuring our intentions with patient scrutiny. Sarah noticed it first, stopping mid-stride to examine a Douglas fir whose trunk bore markings that were clearly deliberate, symbols carved deep into the bark with tool precision, yet arranged in patterns that belonged to no human language or tradition I recognized. Within an hour, we documented dozens of similar trees, all bearing these enigmatic glyphs that seemed to form a perimeter around the valley's interior, and the implications sent theoretical possibilities cascading through my scientific mind, even as something deeper, something inherited from my grandfather's whispered teachings, understood we were looking at boundary markers, warnings carved by hands that bridged the gap between animal and human cognition. The signs multiplied as we established our base camp near a clear stream that ran cold and pure from springs hidden in the mountain's heart. Each discovery adding weight to possibilities my colleagues were beginning to voice with nervous laughter that masked genuine unease. Tom found tracks on the 4th morning, massive impressions in the soft earth near the water's edge. Bipedal and clearly fresh, each footprint nearly 18 inches long, with a stride length that suggested something far larger than any known primate moved through this valley under cover of darkness. Marcus captured recordings of vocalizations that echoed through the forest at dusk, sounds that started as animal calls, but modulated into patterns that felt deliberately structured, almost linguistic, as if something was testing our presence with acoustic probes. We began to feel observed constantly, that primitive awareness of eyes upon you, that evolution, hardwired into prey species, and I noticed how our conversations grew quieter, how we moved with increasing caution, how even Sarah's scientific skepticism began showing cracks as the unexplainable accumulated beyond coincidence. I said nothing about the footage that had brought us here, maintaining my pretense while guilt gnawed at me, but I could see in their faces the same questions forming that had haunted my sleepless nights. What if the legends were real? What if something had survived in these forgotten places? What if the boundary between myth and biology was far more permeable than our modern certainty allowed? The valley seemed to be revealing itself gradually, peeling back, layers of concealment like a test of worthiness, showing us just enough to confirm that something profound shared this space while withholding the final revelation that would transform belief into knowledge. On the sixth night, as we sat around our camp stove, eating freeze-dried meals that tasted like cardboard and civilization, a sound rolled. Through the darkness that froze us all mid-motion, a vocalization so powerful it seemed to vibrate through the earth itself, starting low and rising into frequencies that resonated in my chest cavity and triggered responses in parts of my brain that predated language. It came from somewhere close, perhaps 100 yards beyond our firelights' reach, and it held qualities that were unmistakably purposeful, a call or announcement or perhaps a question directed at the intruders in this ancient sanctuary. Marcus's hand shook as he reached for his audio recorder. Sarah's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, and Tom, experienced unflappable Tom who'd faced charging grizzlies and catastrophic weather without losing composure, whispered words that acknowledged what we all felt but had been afraid to name aloud. In that moment, as the vocalization faded into silence that felt pregnant with waiting presence, I understood that my grandfather's warnings had not been superstitious folklore, but inherited wisdom, and that the choice to bring my team here had set events in motion that were no longer mine to control. The storm arrived with the sudden violence characteristic of these mountains, transforming the valley from cathedral sanctuary into chaos within minutes, as wind tore through the canopy with freight train roar and rain fell in sheets so dense that visibility collapsed to arm's length. We scrambled to secure equipment and reinforce tent lines against gusts that threatened to tear our camp apart, shouting instructions we could barely hear over thunder that detonated overhead like artillery, and in the confusion of that desperate activity, I became separated from the others, chasing a equipment case that tumbled away into the darkening forest like a leaf caught in a river current. I followed it deeper into the trees than I'd intended, branches whipping my face and rain soaking through every layer of clothing until I was shivering violently, and when lightning illuminated the world in stark white flashes, I realized with creeping dread that I'd lost all sense of direction, that the camp was nowhere visible, that I was alone in wilderness that had just revealed its capacity for hostility. Panic touched my chest with cold fingers before training reasserted itself. I needed shelter immediately, needed to survive the night before I could worry about reunion, and when another lightning strike showed a darker shadow in the hillside ahead, I stumbled toward it with grateful desperation. The cave mouth opened like a throat in the granite face, wide enough to enter without crawling, and I pushed inside just as the storm reached its furious peak, the sudden absence of wind and rain so profound it felt like entering another dimension entirely. I stood dripping in the entrance, breathing hard and fumbling for the emergency flashlight in my pack, and when its beam finally cut through the darkness, what it revealed drove all thoughts of the storm from my mind with the force of physical impact. This was no random geological formation or temporary animal den. The cave extended deep into the mountainside, and someone or something had been living here, not recently but regularly, transforming raw stone shelter into something that approached habitation. Stones had been carefully arranged into structures that served clear purposes. A fire pit ringed with rocks, showing evidence of countless uses, their surfaces blackened and heat-cracked, flat stones positioned as surfaces for food preparation or tool work, smaller stones stacked as crude shelving holding objects wrapped in bark and hide. I moved deeper with my heart hammering, the scientist in me cataloguing details, while something older responded with awe to the intelligence these arrangements. represented. This wasn't animal behavior, but neither was it quite human. The tools were too crude, the organization too primitive, yet the intentionality was unmistakable, the evidence of problem-solving cognition that blurred every boundary I'd been trained to maintain between species. Preserved food stores hung from stone protrusions, dried fish, cured meat, gathered roots, all prepared with methods that suggested generations of accumulated knowledge. I touched a hand axe crafted from shaped stone, its edge still sharp, its weight balanced for a hand much larger than mine, and felt something shift in my understanding of what intelligence meant, what consciousness encompassed, what right we had to draw lines declaring ourselves alone in possessing awareness and culture. The cave felt like a museum of impossible anthropology, each artifact challenging assumptions I'd built my career upon. And as I examined these remnants of solitary existence, my fear gradually transformed into something more complex and infinitely more painful. Whoever lived here did so in complete isolation, returning to this stone shelter season after season without companionship or community, maintaining survival routines that stretched back years or perhaps decades in unbroken solitude. The loneliness embedded in this space was almost palpable, a weight in the air that pressed against my chest with suffocating sadness, and I found myself imagining the life of this cave's inhabitant with unwanted empathy. The long nights alone in darkness, the endless cycle of survival without purpose beyond continuation, the profound alienation of being utterly singular in a world that had no category for your existence. My grandfather's words echoed through memory with new resonance, his stories about the old ones told not with fear but with deep melancholy, as if he'd understood something about their fate that I was only now beginning to grasp. These beings, if they existed, weren't monsters to be feared or specimens to be studied. They were refugees, survivors of a world that had moved on without them, clinging to existence in forgotten margins, while the species that had displaced them built civilizations that declared them impossible. The ethical implications crashed over me in waves. What did we owe to intelligence that wasn't human? What responsibility came with discovery? What violence was inherent in exposure and classification, and the inevitable exploitation that would follow revelation? I was still holding the stone axe, still processing the profound sadness soaked into this hidden habitation, when I felt, rather than heard, a presence behind me in the cave's deeper darkness. That animal awareness of being no longer alone, flooding my nervous system with adrenaline that sharpened every sense to painful acuity. My flashlight beam swung toward the movement and caught a reflection of eyes. Large, set wide, gleaming with intelligence that froze me in place more effectively than any threat display could have achieved. The creature stood perhaps 10 feet away, its massive form filling the cave passage, and in that eternal moment before rational thought could reassert itself, I experienced pure existential vertigo, the confirmed impossible made flesh, and watching me with an expression I recognized, despite every difference in morphology and evolution. Those eyes held no aggression, no territorial challenge, only a profound wariness mixed with something that looked heartbreakingly like hope. The desperate, fragile hope of the utterly isolated encountering another conscious being after endless solitude. We stared at each other across the gap between species and understanding, and I saw in that ancient face not a monster but a reflection of loneliness so absolute it made my own isolation seem trivial, and I understood with sudden clarity that this moment would define not just my life, but my responsibility to truths larger than scientific ambition or personal advancement. I remained frozen with the stone axe still clutched in my trembling hand, and the creature made no move toward me, no aggressive gesture or territorial display, instead simply existing in the shared space with a stillness that gradually transformed the charged moment from confrontation into something closer to mutual assessment. After what might have been seconds or minutes, time had lost conventional meaning. I slowly, deliberately set the tool back on its stone shelf, the gesture saying without words that I understood. This was their home, that I recognized the artifacts as belongings rather than specimens, and I saw something shift in those remarkable eyes, a subtle relaxation that suggested the meaning had been received and comprehended. My hands rose slowly, palms outward in the universal posture of peaceful intention, and the creature tilted its massive head, slightly in a gesture that seemed almost curious, studying me with an attention that felt personalized rather than predatory. We stood like that in the flashlight's inadequate glow while the storm raged outside, two beings from different evolutionary paths sharing shelter and silence, and gradually my scientific detachment crumbled completely before the undeniable recognition that I was in the presence of someone, not something, a consciousness as real and complex as my own, despite inhabiting a form my species had relegated to myth and superstition. The creature moved then, not toward me but sideways along the cave wall, and I noticed for the first time how carefully it navigated the space, how its enormous frame avoided disturbing the arranged stones and hanging food stores, moving through its home with the practiced familiarity of countless repetitions. It settled into a seated position against the far wall, the posture so deliberately unthreatening that I felt my racing heart begin to slow, and with hesitant movements I lowered myself to sit as well, mirroring the peaceful intention in a language older than words. We sat across from each other in that stone sanctuary, while lightning illuminated the entrance in periodic flashes and thunder provided a rhythm to our shared silence, and gradually I began noticing details that transformed the encounter from scientific observation into genuine communication. The creature's breathing synchronized with mine after several minutes, a subtle matching of rhythm that created inexplicable connection. And when I shifted my weight it would pause, waiting to see if I was leaving or simply adjusting, showing awareness of my intentions that suggested sophisticated social intelligence. At one point I pulled out my water bottle with slow, obvious movements, and after drinking I set it between us, not as an offering exactly, but as acknowledgement of shared needs, shared vulnerability. The creature's eyes followed the gesture with unmistakable understanding, and though it didn't reach for the bottle, something in its expression softened further, the wariness giving way incrementally to something that looked almost like gratitude for the recognition of common ground. As the storm continued its assault on the mountain, we developed a tentative vocabulary of gesture and attention, a communication built from necessity and genuine desire to bridge the impossible gap between our kinds. When I pointed to myself and spoke my name, the creature responded with a vocalization so low it was felt more than heard, a rumbling that seemed to originate from deep within its chest and resonated through the stone floor beneath us, and though I couldn't replicate the sound, I nodded acknowledgement that it had been offered, that names had been exchanged in whatever form they took across our divide. It gestured toward the cave paintings I hadn't yet noticed, figures drawn in ochre and charcoal on the walls, depicting other forms like itself, families or communities that no longer existed, and the loneliness in that gesture was so profound I felt tears sting my eyes. The creature had been showing me not just its home but its history, the evidence of a people reduced to singular survival, and when our eyes met again, I saw reflected there the unbearable weight of being last, of carrying entire species memory in solitary consciousness with no one to pass it to, no future to justify the suffering of continuation. My grandfather's face surfaced in memory, his expression when he told those old stories, and I understood suddenly that he'd sat where I was sitting, had made this same connection, had carried the weight of this knowledge, until it passed to me like an inheritance I'd never requested, but couldn't refuse. When exhaustion finally pulled me toward sleep, despite the strangeness of the situation, I didn't resist. Some deep instinct, trusting the being who'd shown me only gentleness, despite possessing the physical power to end my life with casual effort. I woke hours later to find the storm past, dawn light filtering softly through the cave entrance, and the creature gone, but carefully placed near my pack was a small carved stone, its surface worn smooth by handling, marked with symbols that matched those carved on the valley's trees. It was a gift, a token of the night's communion, and as I held it in my palm, feeling the weight of trust it represented, I knew I'd been given not just an artifact, but a responsibility that would define every choice I made from this moment forward, a sacred duty to protect what my species would destroy through fear of the different, through need to categorize and control and possess everything intelligence touched. I sat at the cave entrance as morning light transformed the valley below into something ethereal, mist rising from ancient trees like the breath of the earth itself, and the carved stone in my hand seemed to pulse with impossible warmth, as though the creature's touch had left some residual essence within the mineral structure. The weight of decision pressed against my chest with physical force. I could still rejoin my team, still present this evidence, still pursue the recognition that would validate my career and transform cryptozoology from fringe speculation into legitimate science. But as I traced the symbols with my thumb, symbols that matched my grandfather's journal sketches, I dismissed as artistic interpretation rather than documentary precision, I felt the magnitude of betrayal that exposure would constitute not just of the creature's trust, but of generations of silent guardianship my bloodline had maintained, while I pursued degrees and accolades in ignorant ambition. The sun climbed higher, and I remained paralyzed between worlds, between the scientific imperative to document and share discovery and the moral obligation to protect what couldn't protect itself, from humanity's relentless need to consume mystery, to transform wonder into entertainment, to reduce the sacred into specimens behind glass or pixels on screens, feeding endless appetite for novelty without consequence. The sound of voices calling my name drifted up from the valley. My team searching, concerned, probably imagining worst-case scenarios after the storm's violence had separated us, and I stood with legs unsteady from exhaustion and emotional overload, needing to make choices that couldn't be unmade. I looked back into the cave where evidence of impossible intelligence lay scattered in careful arrangement, where my camera could still document what science claimed impossible, and felt my grandfather's presence so strongly I nearly spoke aloud to him, nearly asked for guidance he couldn't provide from whatever place the dead inhabit when their secrets outlive them. But I knew what he would say, knew from the worn journal pages I'd read in childhood, from the way he'd looked at these mountains with expression mixing reverence and sorrow, from the fact he'd chosen silence over recognition his entire life, despite possessing knowledge that would have elevated him to legendary status among researchers and cryptozoologists. He would say that some bridges between human and wild should remain uncrossed, that some beings have earned the right to exist unmolested by camera and scrutiny, that the cost of proving yourself right to a skeptical world was sometimes the destruction of what made being right meaningful in the first place. I began gathering my equipment with movements that felt ritualistic, each action a commitment to the choice crystallizing in my consciousness like ice forming on still water, beautiful and irreversible and absolutely necessary, despite every instinct toward professional advancement, screaming that I was throwing away the opportunity of a lifetime, the discovery that defined careers and rewrote textbooks and justified decades of ridicule from mainstream science. Before leaving the cave, I arranged my own small offering on the stone shelf beside the ancient tools. My grandfather's compass, the one he'd carried on every expedition into these mountains, its brass case engraved with coordinates that I suddenly understood marked not just locations, but sacred boundaries, territories, where the old compact between guardian families and hidden peoples was honored and maintained. The gesture felt inadequate against what I'd been given, against the trust shown in vulnerability and the communion of that storm-wrapped night. But it was what I had to offer beyond silence, beyond protection, a symbol of continuity, of promises kept across generations despite the world's transformation, into something that had little space for mystery or restraint. I spoke no words, uncertain if the creature was near enough to hear, but let my intention fill the space like prayer or vow, the commitment settling into my bones with permanence that would shape every subsequent choice, every report filed, every question asked by colleagues wondering why I'd abandoned the pursuit that had defined my professional identity. As I turned toward the entrance and the voices growing closer, I felt the weight of my grandfather's life make sudden sense, understanding now why he'd seemed both sorrowful and serene in his final years, carrying knowledge that isolated him from conventional success, but connected him to something far older and more essential than academic recognition or public validation of privately held truths. The descent toward my team took me past the marked trees, with their carved warnings I could now read as protection rather than threat. Boundaries established not to keep humans out, but to keep sacred space inviolate from the machinery of exploitation that followed discovery like carrion birds following death. Each symbol I passed reinforced my resolve, and by the time Marcus spotted me and shouted relief that echoed through the valley, I had already constructed the narrative I would tell, a story of getting lost in the storm, taking shelter, finding nothing but weather and fear and humbling reminder of nature's indifference to human ambition. The lies came easily because they served truth, larger than factual accuracy. I stood frozen in the cave's darkness as my headlamp illuminated not an animal, but something that stopped my breath and rewrote every assumption about consciousness and existence I'd carried. Into these mountains, the creature sat against the far wall, with posture suggesting neither aggression nor fear, but rather a profound weariness, and its eyes, those impossible eyes, reflected my light with depth that spoke of decades or centuries of observation, of watching humanity from the edges, while remaining deliberately beyond our perception and our capacity for destruction. It was massive, easily 8 feet even seated, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb shadow rather than merely exist within it. But what struck me with almost physical force wasn't the physicality that would have excited any cryptozoologist, but the unmistakable intelligence radiating from its stillness, the sense that I was being evaluated with criteria I couldn't begin to understand by a mind operating on frequencies science hadn't developed instruments to measure. We remained locked in mutual observation for what might have been seconds or hours, time losing coherence in that charged space, and I felt tears streaming down my face without understanding their source, some deep recognition occurring below conscious thought, some ancient part of my brain acknowledging kinship that modern rationality would dismiss as projection or stress-induced hallucination. The creature made no sound, but slowly extended one massive hand, palm up, in gesture so human it shattered my remaining composure, and I found myself moving forward without conscious decision, drawn by something that transcended fear or scientific curiosity into territory where connection happened through channels civilization had trained us to ignore and dismiss. As I approached, I saw details that would haunt every subsequent dream, hands with articulated fingers, showing tool use capability, facial structure blending ape and human features into something entirely distinct and most devastating, an expression of such profound sadness that I understood immediately this being carried knowledge of loss I couldn't begin to comprehend, had watched its kind diminish and disappear while adapting to ever-shrinking territories and ever-increasing human encroachment. When my hand touched its palm, the contact sent shockwaves through my nervous system, and suddenly I wasn't seeing with just my eyes, but experiencing fragments of memory or vision that couldn't be mine, yet felt absolutely real, forests stretching endless before the first axes fell, groups of these beings living in communities with structure and culture and something approximating language. The gradual retreat as humans multiplied and claimed dominion. The slow horror of watching your species contract generation by generation until solitude became not choice but inevitability. I gasped and pulled back, overwhelmed by information my brain had no framework to process. And the creature's eyes held what I could only interpret as apology mixed with desperate need to be witnessed. To have someone finally understand what was being lost in humanity's relentless transformation of every wild space into resource or recreation. It gestured toward the cave's deeper recesses, and I followed with legs trembling from exhaustion and emotional overload, my light revealing what looked like a gallery of sorts. Flat stones arranged against the walls, bearing images scratched or painted with materials derived from minerals and plants. A visual history spanning what must have been centuries based on weathering and stylistic evolution. The earliest images showed groups of the creatures in what appeared to be seasonal gatherings, maybe 20 or 30 figures depicted with careful attention to individual characteristics. And as the timeline progressed, the numbers dwindled. 15, then 10, then 5, then finally the solitary figure repeated across multiple stones, always alone, always. Watching from distance, as human settlements crept closer through the valleys. One image stopped me completely, a crude but unmistakable portrait of my grandfather, younger than I'd ever known him, standing at a boundary marker with one of the creatures. Both figures rendered with clear respect and what might have been shared purpose, documentation. Of the compact I'd only begun to understand. The creature touched this image with infinite gentleness, then touched my face with the same hand, drawing connection across generations and species with gesture that communicated what words never could, that my grandfather had been friend and protector, that I was recognized as continuation of that lineage, that trust was being extended despite every reason these beings had learned to fear and avoid human contact. In the final chamber, deeper still, I found what looked like a shrine or memorial, and the horror of understanding hit me like physical blow. Small bones arranged with obvious reverence, infant or juvenile remains of the creatures. Own kind, each tiny skeleton positioned as though sleeping, surrounded by offerings of stones and preserved flowers and objects that must have held significance I couldn't interpret. The creature made a sound then, low and keening, vibrating through the cave and through my chest cavity with frequency that bypassed ears and struck directly at the emotional centers of my brain, and I understood with devastating clarity that I was witnessing not just the last of a species, but a being who had outlived its entire family, its entire community, who arranged these small bones and returned to them as humans visited graves, maintaining ritual and memory, even when no one remained to share the significance or continue the tradition. It had shown me everything, the history, the loss, the unbearable solitude of being the final carrier of culture and knowledge that would die completely when its heart finally stopped. And I collapsed to my knees, weeping for this creature, for my grandfather who had known and kept silent, for the hubris of my species that created such extinction through carelessness and greed, and the arrogant assumption that Earth existed solely for human benefit and exploitation. The creature knelt beside me in that chamber of bones and memory, and with deliberate slowness began tracing symbols in the cave's dirt floor, circular patterns intersecting with linear marks. That meant nothing to my conscious mind, but seemed to vibrate with significance just beyond my comprehension's reach. It would draw a symbol, then touch my forehead with fingertips surprisingly gentle, for hands so massive, and each contact brought flashes of understanding that bypassed language entirely, visions of balanced systems older than human, civilization, of forests that thrived when these beings moved through them as caretakers rather than conquerors, of knowledge about plant medicine and animal migration and watershed health that science was only beginning to rediscover through expensive research, what these creatures had understood through generations of patient observation. The tragedy wasn't just biological extinction, but the loss of ecological wisdom that could have taught humanity how to inhabit Earth without destroying it. Solutions to problems we'd created through ignorance that would die permanently when this being's eyes finally closed forever. I understood then why my grandfather had devoted his life to protection and silence, not just preserving a species, but safeguarding knowledge that represented humanity's last chance to remember we were never meant to be separate from nature, but integrated within systems we'd spent centuries trying to dominate and control. The creature stood abruptly, agitation suddenly evident in movements that had been so carefully controlled until now, and it began gathering items from around the cave with unmistakable urgency. Dried plants bundled with careful precision, stones marked with the same symbols covering the walls, small carved figures that might have been talismans or teaching tools for young that never survived to learn their significance. It pressed these objects into my hands with force that communicated desperation, and I realized with horror that this wasn't just sharing but transferring, that the creature had decided I would become the carrier of everything it couldn't preserve alone, that my arrival represented both hope and acknowledgement that its time was running shorter than I'd understood. Through gestures and those impossible eye contacts that transmitted more than words ever could, it showed me hidden valleys where certain plants still grew, migration routes that herds had followed for millennia, cave systems that connected through the mountains, forming refuges that must remain undiscovered if any wild things were to survive the coming decades of climate chaos and human expansion. The weight of responsibility crushed down on me as I understood what was being asked. Not just silence about this species' existence, but active guardianship of entire ecosystems, becoming the human link in protection chain that had apparently operated for generations through people. Like my grandfather, who understood some truths were too dangerous to speak, but too precious to abandon. Then it did something that broke whatever composure I'd managed to rebuild. It brought out a small bundle wrapped in hide, so ancient it crumbled at the edges, and inside lay a journal in my grandfather's handwriting, entries dating back 40 years, documenting encounters and observations and conversations, because apparently communication between my grandfather and these beings had gone far deeper than I'd imagined, had developed into genuine relationship built on decades of trust and mutual respect. I read by headlamp with shaking hands as my grandfather's words described a people, not a species, described complex social structures and spiritual practices and artistic traditions and humor and grief and love expressed in ways that proved consciousness and culture weren't human monopolies, but different expressions of the same fundamental awareness that arose wherever evolution produced sufficient neural complexity. He documented their language, at least fragments, vocalizations combined with gesture and posture that created meaning through multiple channels simultaneously, and recorded stories they'd shared about the world before humans dominated, when many intelligent species coexisted through respect rather than conquest, when Earth held more mystery and more magic, because humanity hadn't yet mapped and claimed and commodified every remaining wild space. The final entry, written just weeks before my grandfather's death, contained a prophecy or prediction that someone from our bloodline would come when the last of the old ones needed help transitioning knowledge forward, that I was expected and prepared for, even though my conscious mind had known nothing, that this moment in this cave had been approaching since my birth. The creature watched me absorb this legacy with eyes that held both hope and resignation, and I understood the impossible position it was placing me in: return to civilization and maintain the silence while carrying knowledge that could revolutionize anthropology and conservation biology, or speak truth and condemn whatever remained of these beings to invasive study at best, and deliberate extermination at worst by humans who feared what they couldn't control. My team was still out there searching, probably desperate with worry about my disappearance, and they would have questions I couldn't answer honestly without breaking trust that spanned generations and species boundaries. The creature moved closer, placing both massive hands on my shoulders with weight that felt like blessing and burden simultaneously, and I heard myself making a promise I had no idea how to keep, that I would protect the valleys and maintain the silence and somehow find way to honor both scientific truth and sacred responsibility to preserve what humanity would destroy through exposure. Tears streamed down my face, and I saw moisture in the creature's eyes too, recognition that we were both trapped by circumstances neither created, both trying to salvage meaning from tragedy that had been centuries in the making, both understanding that sometimes love manifests not through revelation, but through the excruciating discipline of keeping silent while the world demands explanations we cannot provide. The creature released my shoulders and moved to the cave's deepest recess, where shadows pooled so thick my headlamp barely penetrated, and returned carrying something wrapped in layers of woven bark that radiated age like heat from stone. It unwrapped the bundle with ceremonial slowness, revealing photographs, actual modern photographs, and my breath stopped because they showed my grandfather standing beside three of these beings in a clearing I recognized from childhood camping trips, all of them arranged like family portrait, smiling in their different ways. There were more. My great-grandfather, with what must have been the previous generation, images dating back to grainy daguerreotypes showing stern-faced ancestors beside beings that history claimed were merely legend, visual proof that my bloodline hadn't just known about these creatures, but had been bound to them through deliberate covenant spanning back to when my family first settled these mountains. The creature pointed to itself in the photo with my grandfather, then touched its chest, and I understood this was the same individual. These beings lived far longer than humans, meaning this creature had known multiple generations of my family, had watched my grandfather age and die, had perhaps been waiting specifically for me to arrive and accept inheritance I'd never known existed. The weight of generational responsibility crashed over me with force that buckled my knees, understanding that every choice my ancestors made to protect, rather than exploit, to remain silent rather than profit, had been building toward this moment when I would face the same decision that had defined my family's purpose for over a century. It gestured for me to follow deeper into the cave system, through passages so narrow I had to crawl while it moved with ease born from intimate familiarity, until we emerged in a cavern that stole whatever words I might have formed. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with paintings, not primitive cave art, but sophisticated murals depicting the history it had tried to communicate through symbols and visions. Thriving communities of these beings living in balance with forests that stretched unbroken. Across continents, the gradual encroachment of human civilization, clearing and burning and building. The slow retreat into smaller territories and the desperate adaptations as their world compressed generation by generation. There were human figures too, and I recognized the distinctive features of my family line repeated across centuries of images, always shown standing between the beings and other humans, always positioned as protectors and intermediaries, visual documentation of covenant that made my grandfather's journal suddenly context rather than anomaly. The creature pointed to the final panel, still incomplete, showing a single being, itself, and a single human figure rendered, with careful attention that made identification unmistakable. It had painted me, standing in this exact cavern, holding something I couldn't quite distinguish in the torchlight it had depicted. I moved closer, and felt my heart fracture as I realized what the painted version of me held: seeds and scrolls and symbols that transferred knowledge, because this being had been preparing for my arrival, not with hope I would save its species, but with resignation that I would carry forward what would otherwise be permanently lost when its solitary existence finally ended. The creature began a vocalization I'd heard only fragments of before, a sound that started low and built through harmonics. That shouldn't have been possible from a single throat, a song that filled the cavern until the stone itself seemed to vibrate with frequencies that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my chest. I understood without translation this was their funeral song, the way these beings honored those who passed, and it was singing not for itself, but for all those already gone, for the children who never reached maturity, for the elders who died knowing their wisdom would die with them, for the communities that once thrived and now existed only in memory and paint on hidden stone. Tears blurred my vision as the song continued, and I found my own voice joining in wordless harmony, grieving for loss that transcended this single species to encompass every vanishing wild thing, every silenced mystery, every sacred presence that human expansion had erased through indifference or intention. The creature's eyes met mine through the darkness, and in that gaze I saw my grandfather reflected back, the same sorrow he'd carried quietly his entire life, the same fierce protectiveness that had kept him returning to these mountains season after season, the same love that manifested as silence because speaking would have meant betrayal of trust, more valuable than fame or recognition. I finally understood that my family's legacy wasn't built on secrets kept from the world, but on promises made to beings who had no other advocates, that we had chosen deliberate obscurity over historical significance because some relationships matter more than humanity's endless hunger to document and possess and explain every remaining mystery. The song faded into silence that felt dense with presence rather than absence, and the creature placed one massive hand over my heart, holding it there until our breathing synchronized, until the boundary between its grief and mine dissolved into shared recognition that we were both inheritors of loss we hadn't caused, but were responsible for addressing. It released me and returned to the painted wall, adding final details to the image of me with such careful precision. I understood this represented hope despite everything, hope that I would prove worthy of the legacy, that I would find strength my grandfather had found to carry unbearable knowledge without breaking, that some part of what these beings represented would continue forward even after the last physical form returned to the forest that created it. I made a decision in that moment that I felt in my bones and blood, not chosen rationally, but recognized as inevitable. I would become what my family had always been, guardian of mysteries the world wasn't ready to receive, protector of sacred things that would be destroyed by exposure, keeper of silence that preserved more than speaking ever could. The creature sensed my commitment somehow, and for the first time since our encounter began, I saw something like peace settle across its ancient features, the burden of solitary guardianship finally shared with someone who understood the cost and accepted it anyway. I emerged from the cave system as dawn broke over the valley, my headlamp dying just as natural light filtered through the canopy, and found my team exactly where the creature had somehow known they would be, gathered at our base camp, exhausted and terrified, preparing a search party they'd assumed would be looking for my body. Their relief at seeing me alive transformed quickly into urgent questions about where I'd been, what I'd found, why my equipment showed hours of recording time that I claimed was corrupted static, and I felt the weight of my family's traditions settle across my shoulders like a mantle passed from generation to generation. I met their eyes with practiced casualness and delivered the lie that would become my truth. I'd gotten disoriented in the storm, taken shelter in a shallow cave, waited out the weather, found nothing of significance beyond my own fear and exhaustion, amplified by isolation. They wanted to believe me because the alternative meant acknowledging the unexplainable phenomena we'd all experienced, the feeling of being watched that had never left us, the footprints and vocalizations that defied conventional zoological explanation. I watched them choose comfortable skepticism over unsettling mystery, saw how easily people accepted mundane explanations when the alternative required them to fundamentally reconsider what they understood about the world, and I felt a deep kinship with my grandfather, who must have navigated these same conversations countless times, always steering people away from truth they would weaponize through good intentions or bad. The hike back to civilization felt longer than the journey in, each step carrying me further from the encounter that had redefined my understanding of purpose and closer to a world where I would have to perform normalcy while carrying extraordinary knowledge like a stone in my chest. My team discussed the expedition in terms of scientific failure, no verifiable evidence, no publishable data, nothing to justify the funding or time investment, while I remained silent, knowing that by their metrics we had indeed found nothing, but by measures that actually mattered I had discovered everything. I thought about the photographs still hidden in that cave, the painted history on stone walls, the funeral song that continued to echo in my bones, and I understood that my grandfather had walked this same path dozens of times, returning from the mountains with empty hands and full heart, bearing witness to existence he could never share. The anonymous footage that had started this entire journey felt like a test now, perhaps sent by someone else who knew, or maybe manifested by forces I didn't fully understand. A call to accept inheritance that couldn't be delivered through conventional means. I reached my truck and looked back at the mountain range one final time before leaving, and I swear I saw a massive figure standing at the tree line, watching, confirming that our connection hadn't ended with dawn, but had merely transformed into the same patient guardianship my ancestors had maintained. The falsified report wrote itself with surprising ease, clinical language describing investigation of alleged anomalous footage, thorough documentation of search parameters, conclusive findings of misidentification combined with environmental factors and technical recording errors, recommendation that the case be closed and filed under explained phenomena. I submitted it to the academic review board and watched respected colleagues nod with satisfaction, relieved that the natural order remained intact, that their understanding of biological possibility didn't require expansion, that mystery had been satisfactorily resolved through rational explanation. I destroyed the original footage with ceremonial care, degaussing the drives and burning the physical media, watching years of potential fame and academic recognition turn to ash and scattered magnetic particles, and I felt not loss, but profound rightness. My grandfather's journal went into a locked safe, along with coordinates I would memorize and then obscure, knowledge that would live in memory rather than documentation, protected by the same deliberate obscurity that had kept these beings hidden for generations. I established a foundation using inherited money I'd never understood the source of until now. Funds my grandfather had quietly accumulated and designated for continuing the protection, money that would purchase land around the valley and adjacent territories, creating buffer zones explained through environmental conservation, but serving deeper purpose only I fully understood. Months later, I returned to the mountains alone, hiking familiar trails that felt different now, laden with significance they'd always possessed, but I'd been too blind to recognize. The cave welcomed me like returning home, and I found small offerings left in places the creature knew I would look. Carved wooden tokens, arrangements of stones forming symbols I was learning to interpret, fresh paintings added to the cavern walls, showing the two of us standing together in postures of mutual guardianship. I left my own offerings in return, supplies carefully chosen to be useful, but untraceable medical equipment, preserved foods, Books I thought might bring comfort to intelligence that had endured centuries of isolation, small gestures of relationship that transcended species and spoke to the fundamental loneliness we both carried. I never saw the creature directly on these visits, but I always felt its presence, a consciousness observing from the shadows with what I chose to interpret as gratitude. And I understood that this was how the guardianship worked, not through constant contact, but through faithful presence. The knowledge that neither of us faced our respective burdens entirely alone. I established the pattern my grandfather had followed: regular visits timed with seasons, maintaining the boundary markings, occasionally redirecting hikers or researchers who wandered too close to sacred territory, living a double life where my public work as a biologist provided perfect cover for private purpose that gave everything meaning. The loneliness my grandfather had carried made sense now. Not the isolation of keeping secrets, but the solitude of bearing witness to beauty and tragedy so profound that sharing would diminish rather than amplify it. The weight of loving something you could protect only through silence, the bittersweet honor of being trusted with what humanity had proven unworthy to receive. I lived 2 lives for 15 years. The public one where I published papers on wolf pack dynamics and forest ecosystem recovery, speaking at conferences and mentoring graduate students who saw me as dedicated but oddly distant, and the private one where I walked ancient trails my grandfather had walked, maintaining boundaries invisible to everyone except the ones they were designed to protect. The duality became not a burden, but a strange comfort, each existence giving meaning to the other. My scientific work providing credible reason for mountain presence, while my guardianship gave purpose to knowledge I accumulated about wilderness preservation and human psychology. I watched the world change around me, technology advancing, satellite imagery becoming so detailed you could count individual trees from space, hiking culture exploding as people sought Instagram-worthy wilderness experiences, and I adapted the protection accordingly, purchasing additional buffer properties, establishing conservation easements, sometimes even creating false leads that sent cryptid hunters to completely different mountain ranges. The creature and I developed a wordless communication system over the years, and I slowly understood there were others, not many, perhaps a dozen, scattered across the most remote territories of the Pacific Northwest, connected through networks of symbols and seasonal migrations. I was only beginning to comprehend. My grandfather's journal revealed itself as merely one volume in a library of guardianship, and I added my own observations to the collection, knowing someday I would need to identify my successor, pass this mantle to someone whose heart could hold mystery without needing to exploit it. The moment that changed everything came during what should have been a routine supply run 15 years into my guardianship, when I found the creature waiting at our usual meeting place, but accompanied by something I had never imagined possible. A juvenile, smaller, but unmistakably the same species, eyes filled with curiosity rather than the ancient sorrow I had grown accustomed to. Seeing, the adult made gestures I had learned to interpret, communicating that this young one had been born 3 years prior, hidden and protected, representing the first successful birth in nearly a century, hope emerging from what had seemed like inevitable extinction. I understood immediately why I was being shown this precious secret. It was trust beyond what my grandfather had ever experienced, an invitation into deeper guardianship, and also a request I felt in my bones before any gestures confirmed it. The young one would need protection for decades to come, guidance into a world even more dangerous and intrusive than the one its parent had survived. I knelt in the dirt before these magnificent beings and made a promise that transcended words, committing not just my remaining years, but whatever legacy I could arrange, understanding that I needed to establish systems that would outlive me, protections that didn't depend on a single guardian's lifetime. The juvenile approached me with innocent boldness, reaching out to touch my face with fingers that were almost human, but not quite, and I felt tears streaming down my cheeks as I recognized what I was witnessing, not just survival, but futurity, the possibility that mystery and wonder might persist beyond this generation. I spent the next 5 years restructuring everything with new urgency, establishing the Conservation Foundation on permanent legal footing, creating endowments that would fund land protection in perpetuity, identifying and carefully vetting potential future guardians without ever revealing the full truth until I was certain of their character. I found her eventually, a young indigenous researcher whose grandmother had known my grandfather, whose family carried their own versions of the old stories, whose eyes held the same reverence for mystery that I recognized from my own mirror. I brought her into the mountains gradually over 2 years, teaching her the trails and boundaries, sharing edited versions of the history, watching how she moved through wilderness with natural respect rather than conquest. And finally, when I was certain, I took her to the cave and let her see what I had protected. She wept as I had wept, understood as I had understood, and accepted the guardianship with the same mixture of honor and heartbreak that had defined my adult life. The creature revealed itself to her in my presence, a passing of witness that felt ceremonial, even without formal ritual, and I saw recognition pass between them, the ancient and the young, both carrying responsibilities they had never asked for, but would fulfill because some callings choose us rather than the opposite. I taught her everything my grandfather had taught me, and everything I had learned, beyond his knowledge, made her memorize the coordinates and the symbols, introduced her to the network of buffer properties and legal protections, and slowly stepped back from primary guardianship into advisory role, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders even as different weight settled there, the responsibility of elder rather than active protector. Now I am the age my grandfather was when he first took me to these mountains, and I understand finally what I saw in his eyes that day. Not fear of the unknown, but exhaustion from knowing too much. Not warning me away from danger, but preparing me for inheritance he knew would claim me eventually. I sit on my porch in the foothills and watch my successor make the seasonal journeys I once made, knowing she will eventually find her own successor, continuing the chain of guardianship that stretches back further than my family's records show and will extend forward beyond my capacity to imagine. The juvenile is nearly adult now, strong and wise, and there are rumors my successor has shared carefully about other young ones being born in different territories, suggesting that perhaps the species has turned some invisible corner from extinction toward fragile persistence. I destroyed evidence and falsified reports and lived with loneliness and secrecy for decades, and I would make the same choice again without hesitation. Because I learned that some truths are too precious for exposure, some mysteries too sacred for solving, and some loves too profound for anything except silent protection. The world continues thinking these beings are legend or hoax or misidentification, and that deliberate ignorance is the greatest gift humanity has accidentally given, the blessing of disbelief that functions as camouflage, more effective than any evolutionary adaptation. I will die someday with my secrets intact, having never published the discovery that would have made my career, having chosen guardianship over glory, and I know with absolute certainty that this choice was the only one my soul could have survived making. What secret would you protect even if it cost you everything? Subscribe to witness more encounters with the mysterious and unexplainable.